But capital was huge. There was a lot of concepts that go into it. So here's a slide with some very oversimplified kind of key points from Capital. And again, it's giant, and you got to read that separately. But some ideas are that the state enforces relative scarcity for the benefit of the ruling class. So it basically enforces poverty. We were talking about it earlier. It makes sure that things are scarce, that people can't always get what they need, so that the ruling class always has this leg up. It always has this advantage over workers. Marx identified how the modern state, how the modern government, the modern republics that exist today arose from monarchy. It's understanding that history thing again, and became perfected in his term by capitalism. So that capitalism and the state, capitalism and the government, so to speak, manage the affairs of the wealthy. And he talked about, the state and capitalism are always compelled to grow. Bookchin's grow or die imperative, more or less, that the ruling class has to always make more profits and own more things and all this stuff. Produce more things to sell more things. You get this circular cycle that's terrible. And then Marx identified the working class, and that the working class had to gain its own power to halt the oppression, and that it was necessary to kind of build a workers' state against the capitalist state, against the wealthy capitalist state, in order to really fundamentally change the system. So in kind of the final sort of conclusion, the working class had to advocate for itself. It had to organize itself. It had to create its own independent structures and all, and build this so-called workers' state, build new institutions, a new government, so to speak, in order to deal with capitalism and to eventually replace capitalism with a new type of system that would actually fulfill all of the goals and all that we were talking about earlier. And that over time, the workers' state itself, which is still kind of hierarchical when you have this kind of state government and all, you still have certain people in charge of certain things, and they get elected to certain things and all that. Over time, that itself would have to go away and eventually become this kind of truly democratic society where everyone really has a say-so, and we're not putting too much power or influence or wealth or whatever into certain people. But that would happen kind of naturally as capitalism itself is dismantled by this process of the working class fighting for itself. So
yeah,
go ahead, Chris.
Another really important thing I think Marx did in moving, from the utopians, Kant and Hegel especially like to talk about ideas. Their work lived, in the world of ethics and linguistics and envisioning and talking about ideas. And Marx came in and introduced this idea of materialism. Not the way that we use it in modern times, right? Not it can apply, materialism, how we tend to use it colloquially, is about capitalist materialism. What Marx was talking about is we need to get out of the world of ideas, and we need to start getting into the real world. We need to address, and if you, another thing that you have to consider is, like Owen, most of these early thinkers were affluent. They had a level of privilege, a level of stability that let Kant didn't start writing until his 70s and then produced just an outrageous amount of works at the end of his life, right? My mentor in school always told people, if Marx makes you feel inadequate, having published groundbreaking work at the age of 27, don't worry, Kant didn't publish his first book until his 70s, right? But they were coming, they were coming from a place of privilege, right? And that allowed them to sit in their cafes and talk about things and think about ideas. And Marx grew up in this system, right? He was a young Hegelian. They would sit in the coffee houses and would fight and debate and discuss ideas for hours and days on end. But when Marx actually when it came time for Marx to, start putting his own analysis, his own ideas, his own prescriptions out there, he kind of rejected this in our mind-centric thought, and he oriented towards the material world, right? So when we talk about materialist in a Marxist sense, we're meaning addressing things that are happening in the real world, right? The real oppressions, that what poverty looks like to people. What are the actual structures in the world that are causing that poverty? What are upholding them? Who's benefiting from it? Who's not? And this was a big break, right? This is a really big break. And in a way, it's very apt to today, where a lot of material world organizing is disappearing, and it's being replaced by remote and digital organizing, which is nowhere near as effective as getting out into the real world, right, into material space and talking to people about the real problems in their lives face to face. So that was a huge change, right? And when you make that change from talking about what ifs and idea-centric things into how do we change the material conditions of the world, now organizing becomes centric, right? Organizing becomes absolutely essential, right? And Saren Starr has been in the chat on YouTube talking about, we need a network on the ground and the grassroots. We need to be able to hold rallies. We need to be able to inform people about Bernie. That is all about what next month's 101 workshop. So that'll be Organizing 101 on Tuesday, September 27th at 8 p.m. And we'll go, deep into, how to actually theories on organizing and how to actually go out and talk to people. But it was a really important shift that Marx made, right? Because Kant and Hegel weren't ever going to do anything but ask nicely, right? And we already talked about the efficacy of asking your oppressors nicely. It's not going to really, bring you great results. And so when Marx came in and focused on the material world, that refocused solutions to action, right? To strike, to revolution, to various forms of strife and agitation and education and all of the things that we need to do, to bring about socialism. But it's a really important shift that happened, with Marx, and it's really, it's really impressive that Marx was able to, spot so much of this stuff, like the state, like the nation state was very young when Marx was writing, to the point that not only did England and Germany have distinct cultures and were distinct societies, but Germany wasn't even united yet, right? There were distinct German provinces that had their own distinct cultures and that were different, and that's the world that Marx grew out of. But he could see what was happening. He could see what was coming. He saw the power that this central state was going to have. And when you look at Marx's work, there's a lot of room to quibble and disagree and critique his prescriptions, but even conservatives tend to address his critiques, because he was very much on point, and it's really impressive how on point he was when you consider he didn't ever see capitalism. Right, he was kind of living in a proto, just being born, capitalism. And I don't remember if we get into this on the slides, so I'm just going to say it quick and not get into it. But he wasn't around for globalization meets capitalism, right? When all of the shit really hit the fan and took on a whole new meaning, to the point that we're at now, where the state isn't even the power source that it went from the state upholding capitalism, as the main power source, to now the state is a puppet of capitalism in most cases. So, there were some really important ideas. That materialism switch was super important, and then it's really important it's really interesting to think about what he was seeing in terms of capitalism, right? And his partner Engels, we talked about Owen was a factory owner. Engels' family owned factories, right? And so he was a member of the bourgeoisie that he was writing about, right? And he definitely got a lot. He suffered in terms of his affluence there, but it was a different time, but he was able to see the writing on the wall for what it would become, to the point that 200 years later, we're still addressing it, right? If he had only dealt with proto-capitalism that he saw in the world, we wouldn't be addressing Marx the way we address Marx. We would be addressing other post-Marxists that are super important still, that caught this stuff, right, in real time. But the fact that we still address him today with at such a level shows that his analysis, his critiques, had a forethought and a vision that was beyond what he was actually seeing in the world. This is where I'm more of the Marxist and Garrett's more of the Bakunin municipal.
Yes, I definitely wanted to hand the slide over to Chris on this, because there's a lot of important Marxist ideas here. And, as Chris pointed out, in some ways, Marx's analysis is somewhat old. It's 200 years old, and he grew up before the neoliberal global order that we live in today. But at the same time, some of that analysis was just so good and so on point that it still applies today, and it's still really worth a read and grappling and thinking about in terms of how does it apply to today. Maybe it doesn't necessarily apply in the same way today, but it's really worth thinking about and integrating into our organizing methods today.